In this demonstration, we're going to practice extending volumes and creating mount points. To perform these tasks, I need to be in Disk Management, so I'll right-click Start and select Disk Management. I'll maximize the window so we can see what we're doing a little better. Notice that on this system, I have 4 hard drives installed: Disk 0, 1, 2, and 3. Disk 3 has an NTFS volume that encompasses the entire drive, whereas Disk 0 is where Windows have been installed and where my user profile named Data is stored. I also have a volume named Data on Disk 0 as well. Notice that my C volume is only about 20 gigabytes in size, which is smaller for a system volume on Windows. As soon as a user starts downloading files and installing applications from here, they're going to run out of space fast. To help avoid this, we can extend this volume to use some of the other unallocated space located next to it. To start this process, I right-click on the C volume, select Extend Volume, and then click Next on the welcome screen. Here we need to specify which unallocated space in the system we want to add to this volume. Notice that the wizard is only allowing us to use the 6 gigabytes of unallocated space, which is adjacent to the C volume. That's because there are several key rules that govern how you can extend a system volume on Windows. First, if your disk is configured as a basic disk, you can only use contiguous unallocated space. Contiguous means it must be right next to the volume you're expanding. For example, even though I have about 3 gigabytes of space over here, I'm not allowed to add it to the C volume since it's not contiguous. Also, notice that we're not given the option to use the 32 gigabytes of space on Disk 1 and 2. That's because of the second rule, which is that when working with a basic disk, you can't extend the volume across multiple hard disk drives. The space must reside on the same drive. So without deleting the data partition, we're limited to just this one 5 gigabyte area. Let's go ahead and add it by selecting Next and then Finish. That boosts the volume up to about 25 gigabytes, still probably not enough for a production system, but this will work fine for our demonstration. When I right-click on the C volume again, notice that Extend Volume is now grayed out. That's because there's no more contiguous unallocated space available that can be added to C. Another rule that you need to keep in mind regarding extending volumes is that you can only extend NTFS volumes. For example, when I right-click on the data volume, the Extend Volume option is grayed out, even though there's free contiguous space next to it. This is because the data volume is FAT32. We can fix this, though, by converting it to NTFS. To do that, I right-click on the data volume and select Format. Then, using the drop-down menu next to File System, I'll choose NTFS and click OK. The system will remind you that formatting the volume erases all data and that you should back up any data you want to keep before formatting. I know there's no data on this volume that I need to keep, so I'll just click OK. The data volume is now converted from a FAT32 volume to an NTFS volume. Now, when I right-click the data volume, I can select Extend Volume and, when I click Next, you see that it's automatically selected the 3 gigabyte space that are contiguous to the data volume. That volume is now about 6 gigabytes in size. Let's shift gears a bit and discuss creating mount points. Let's suppose that my users have been using the C volume, and it's starting to get full. When I right-click on this volume, we see the same situation where there's no contiguous space available. So what are our options? Well, we could move the existing data on the F drive and then use that space to extend the C volume. Another option is to create a mount point on the C volume's file system and point it to another partition where there's adequate space. To a user, a mount point looks like a folder. But when the mount point folder is opened and data stored in it, they're really storing their data on a different partition. To see how this works, let's first create a new volume on Disk 1. To do that, I'll right-click on the unallocated space associated with Disk 1, select New Simple Volume, and click Next. Since we want to use all the available disk space, I'll click Next again. Now, instead of assigning a drive letter to the new volume, I'm going to mount it to an empty NTFS folder. To create that folder, I click Browse and then Expand C. Let's create a new folder called Extra Space. This brings up a very important point. The folder where you're going to mount this volume must be empty. It can't already have files in it. Click OK and then Next. Let's give it a volume label of Extra Space to remind us of the folder we're creating the mount point for. Click Next and Finish. It's also important to note that not only does the mount point need to be an empty folder, but the folder must exist on an NTFS volume. When I open File Explorer and go to the C drive and then navigate to where I can see the Extra Space folder, you see that the folder has a slightly different icon. It has a small white box with a little arrow. When I open it up, what's really happening is that I'm being redirected from the Extra Space folder located on C to the volume down here called Extra Space. When I create a new file in the Extra Space folder, maybe a new bitmap image, that file doesn't reside in C Extra Space. It resides down here in this volume named Extra Space on Disk 1. Now let's suppose that we're also running out of space on our data volume. It's an NTFS volume, and there is still free unallocated space on Disk 2. But when I right-click on F, notice that I don't have the option to extend the volume. Remember what I said a minute ago. If the disk type is BASIC, you can't extend the volume beyond just the local hard disk drive. This means that, as it now stands, I'd need to have extra space available on disk 0 to extend the size of the data volume. But the rule only applies if you're dealing with basic disks. Everything changes if we convert to a dynamic disk type. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll come over here, right-click on disk 0, and then select Convert to Dynamic Disk. Here you see that we're given the opportunity to select which disks we want to convert. Let's mark disk 0 and disk 2 and then click OK. But when I click Convert, notice that it warns us that if we do this, we won't be able to start any installed operating systems from any volumes on these disks except for the current boot volumes. Since we only have one operating system installed on C, and it's in the boot volume, we're OK to click Yes. Notice the colors at the top of the C and F volumes were changed, and that the label for disk 0 and disk 2 now indicate that they're dynamic. With that change now in place, I can right-click on my data volume and select the Extend Volume option. Now when I click Next in the Welcome screen, I see that the space available on disk 2 can be added to the data volume. Let's go ahead and add all the space available on disk 2 to our data volume. Click Next, and then click Finish. Notice that the data volume now encompasses its original space on disk 0, as well as the 32 gigabytes of space from disk 2. When I open File Explorer and select this PC, I see that the data volume is over 37 gigabytes in size. So now, when I open the data volume, right-click and select New, Bitmap Image. That file will be saved in our data partition on either disk 0 or disk 2, since both are part of the volume. Frankly, we don't care as long as we can retrieve it. Windows takes care of keeping track of which disk a file is on when the volume spans different disks. Before ending this demo, there's one more rule you need to know. Even though you may have converted your system volume to a disk type of dynamic, and you might still have some free unallocated space on another disk, you won't be able to extend the system volume to another disk. So if you're still running out of space on C at this point, and you wanted to add space to it, your best option is to back up the data on the F volume and then delete that volume. After you've deleted that volume, you can then recreate the data volume using only the space on disk 2. With the data volume recreated just on disk 2, you'd then restore the data from the backup to this new volume. Then you can come up to C, right-click, select Extend the Volume, and then consume the rest of the unallocated space on disk 0, bumping it up to around 30 gigabytes. Well, that's it for this demonstration on mount points and volumes. We went over how to extend volumes and create mount points.